The afternoon sun settled upon St. Mary Mead with the deliberate satisfaction of a cat claiming its favourite window-sill. The annual Whitsun garden party at the vicarage had drawn its usual assembly of village worthies, each playing their appointed role in the gentle theatre of English country life. Paper bunting fluttered between the ancient elm trees, and the scent of Mrs. Hartley's prize roses mingled with the more practical aromas of cucumber sandwiches and Earl Grey tea. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the spreading branches of a laburnum tree, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm while her mild blue eyes observed the social currents flowing around her. At 73, she had learned that the most interesting dramas often unfolded not on stages, but in the seemingly innocent gatherings of respectable people who believed themselves unobserved. The centerpiece of today's festivities was undoubtedly Lady Octavia Pringle, who had graciously consented to judge the flower competition and present the prizes. At 55, Lady Pringle possessed the kind of commanding presence that made rooms seem smaller and conversations more careful. She moved through the gathering in a dress of dove-grey silk, her famous Pringle pearls catching the afternoon light with each gesture. The pearls were said to have belonged to the first Lady Pringle, and they suited their current owner's imperious manner perfectly. "Such a generous woman," murmured Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, settling herself on the garden chair beside Miss Marple. "Though I do sometimes wonder if generosity isn't easier when one has so very much to be generous with." Miss Marple's needles never paused. "Indeed, though I've noticed that having much doesn't always make the giving easier. Sometimes quite the reverse." Lady Pringle was at that moment engaged in animated conversation with her stepdaughter, Miss Isabel Pringle. The young woman, perhaps 25 and possessed of the kind of pale, ethereal beauty that suggested either great sensitivity or poor health, listened to her stepmother with an expression of barely concealed tension. Dr. Edmund Reeves stood nearby, his attention divided between the conversation and his obvious concern for Miss Isabel's evident distress. "The dear doctor is quite devoted to young Isabel," Mrs. Clement observed, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Though I'm not entirely certain Lady Pringle approves of the attachment. She has rather grander plans for the girl, I believe." Miss Marple noted the way Dr. Reeves's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and how Miss Isabel's fingers worried at the corner of her program until it began to tear. Whatever Lady Pringle was saying, it was causing considerable distress to both young people. The afternoon progressed with the measured pace of village tradition. The Reverend Hartley delivered his customary remarks about community spirit. Mr. Appleyard from the bank won the prize for his late roses, and the children's races provided the usual mixture of triumph and tears. Lady Pringle moved through it all with queenly authority, dispensing praise and criticism with equal certainty. It was during the presentation of prizes that Miss Marple first noticed Miss Lydia Finch, Lady Pringle's companion. A thin, nervous woman of indeterminate middle age, Miss Finch hovered at her employer's elbow like an anxious shadow. Her shoes, Miss Marple observed, bore traces of mud along the soles, dried earth that suggested a morning walk along paths not typically frequented by garden party guests. "I shall retire briefly to freshen up before the raffle," Lady Pringle announced as the last prize was awarded. "Miss Finch, do see that the tea service is properly managed in my absence, and have Owen bring the motor car around to the side entrance. I dislike having it drip on the gravel." Owen Pike, the chauffeur, touched his cap respectfully, though Miss Marple noticed the tightness around his eyes that suggested the gesture cost him some effort. A man of perhaps 40, Pike had the weathered look of someone who had seen harder times than his current position suggested. Lady Pringle swept toward the house with her usual authority, the grey silk of her dress catching the breeze. Miss Finch watched her go with an expression that might have been relief, though she quickly busied herself with the tea arrangements when she noticed Miss Marple's gentle attention. The minutes stretched on. The raffled tickets lay ready in their basket, the prizes arranged on their table, but Lady Pringle did not return. Mrs. Hartley consulted her watch with increasing frequency, and murmurs began to ripple through the gathering. Perhaps someone should check on her ladyship, Dr. Reeves suggested, though his tone carried more obligation than concern. Miss Finch volunteered for the task, returning several minutes later with a puzzled frown. "She's not in the drawing-room, nor the morning-room. I knocked on her study door, but there was no answer." The search that followed was thorough, but revealed nothing. Lady Pringle's handbag remained on her dressing table, her jewelry case undisturbed. The French doors to her study stood slightly ajar, opening onto the rose garden where she had been seen earlier in animated conversation with someone, though no one could quite remember whom. It was young Timothy Clement who discovered the first tangible clue. "I say, there's something odd here," he called from near the garden wall. In the grass beneath Lady Pringle's prized climbing rose lay a small silver button, its surface etched with an intricate pattern that caught the fading light. Miss Marple examined the button carefully, noting its quality and the freshness of the thread still attached to one edge. Someone had lost this very recently, and in some haste. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the search proved fruitless, a different kind of tension settled over the gathering. Lady Pringle had not simply stepped away. She had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened to receive her. Miss Marple remained in the rose garden as the other guests departed, her attention caught by something small and bright near the base of the climbing rose. A single cornflower petal, vivid blue against the dark earth, lay where it had no business being. Lady Pringle's hat had been adorned with cornflowers, she recalled, though the nearest cornflower border was on the far side of the house. Standing slowly, Miss Marple tucked both the petal and her observations away, with the same care she applied to her knitting. In her long experience, the smallest details often proved the most significant, and someone had been very careful to ensure that Lady Pringle's disappearance appeared both sudden and inexplicable. But Miss Marple had noticed the mud on Miss Finch's shoes, the tension in Dr. Reeves's manner, and the way Owen Pike's eyes had followed his employer with something that was not quite the appropriate deference of a servant. Most telling of all, she had observed that not everyone present seemed genuinely surprised by Lady Pringle's disappearance. As the sun set over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind already turning over the curious events of the afternoon. Lady Pringle's vanishing would soon be the talk of the county, but the truth, she suspected, lay much closer to home, hidden among the familiar faces and comfortable assumptions of village life. Someone had wanted Lady Pringle to disappear, and they had chosen their moment with considerable care. The question was not whether she would be found, but what that discovery would reveal about the carefully maintained facades of those who had gathered to honor her that afternoon. The morning after Lady Pringle's disappearance dawned grey and unsettled, as if the very weather reflected the village's unease. By 8:30, the news had travelled the length of St. Mary Mead with the efficiency that only genuine scandal could achieve. Miss Marple, taking her customary early walk to collect the post, found herself the recipient of no fewer than 3 urgent consultations before she had even reached the village green. Mrs. Price Ridley, emerging from her cottage with unusual haste, was the first to waylay her. "Oh, Miss Marple, such a dreadful business. I've barely slept a wink thinking about poor Lady Pringle. Mark my words, it's those travelling people who were camped near Henderson's Field last week. They've made off with her for her jewellery, depend upon it." Miss Marple listened with her customary patience, though she noted that the travellers had departed well before the garden party, a fact that seemed to have escaped Mrs. Price Ridley's consideration. Before she could respond, Colonel Bantry appeared, his face flushed with the importance of his theory. "Nonsense about gypsies," he declared with military certainty. "More likely that surly chauffeur of hers. Pike always had a shifty look about him, and servants today haven't the loyalty they once had. Lady Pringle wasn't known for her gentle hand with the staff." The third theory came from Mrs. Hartnell at the post office, who was convinced that Lady Pringle had received threatening letters and gone into hiding. "There's always blackmail involved in these cases, Miss Marple. I've read enough detective novels to know the signs." Miss Marple accepted each theory with polite interest, while privately noting how readily people seized upon explanations that cast suspicion away from themselves and their immediate circle. It was, she reflected, a very human tendency to prefer mysteries that could be solved by pointing fingers at strangers. The arrival of Inspector Slack from Much Benham shortly before noon brought a semblance of official order to the proceedings. Miss Marple had encountered the inspector on previous occasions and found him to be a competent, if unimaginative, officer who preferred his cases to fit into neat categories with clear motives and obvious suspects. Inspector Slack established his headquarters in the vicarage study, the same room where Lady Pringle had last been seen. His initial examination revealed no signs of struggle or forced entry, confirming what the previous evening's search had already suggested. The French doors to the rose garden remained slightly ajar, exactly as they had been found, and the grass showed only the expected trampling from the garden party guests. Miss Finch, Lady Pringle's companion, provided the most detailed account of the disappearance. Seated rigidly upright in the vicar's best chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, she recounted Lady Pringle's movements with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every detail. Her ladyship announced her intention to freshen up before the raffle, Miss Finch explained in her thin, nervous voice. She specifically requested that Owen bring the motor car to the side entrance, as she disliked walking across the gravel in her good shoes. "I remain to oversee the tea service, as instructed." Inspector Slack made careful notes. "And when did you realize she was missing?" "After perhaps 20 minutes had passed. The raffle was scheduled to begin, and her ladyship was most particular about punctuality. When she failed to appear, I went to look for her." Miss Finch's voice wavered slightly. "I searched the drawing room, the morning room, even knocked on her study door, but there was no response." Owen Pike's testimony was briefer, but no less significant. The chauffeur, cap in hand and eyes downcast, confirmed that he had brought the Daimler around as requested, and waited at the designated spot. "Waited near on half an hour, I did," he said in his rough voice. "Then Miss Finch came running, all in a flutter, saying her ladyship couldn't be found." Miss Marple, who had positioned herself unobtrusively near the window with her knitting, observed the pacy interplay between the witnesses with growing interest. She noted how Miss Finch's eyes darted toward Owen whenever Inspector Slack questioned him, and how the chauffeur's hands clenched and unclenched when he spoke of waiting for his employer. Most intriguing was the faint scent she detected when Owen passed close to her chair. Not merely the expected odors of motor oil and leather, but something sweeter, reminiscent of crushed flowers. The inspector's attention soon turned to the more obvious suspects. Dr. Reeves and Miss Isabel were questioned together, their evident distress lending weight to the inspector's growing suspicion that the disappearance might be connected to the tension that had been observed between Lady Pringle and the young couple. "You admit there was some disagreement between yourself and Lady Pringle?" Inspector Slack pressed, his pencil poised over his notebook. Dr. Reeves flushed, but answered steadily, "Lady Pringle had concerns about my understanding with Miss Isabel. She felt the match was unsuitable, given the difference in our circumstances. But, Inspector, surely you cannot suggest that a disagreement over a courtship would lead to whatever has befallen her." Miss Isabel, pale but composed, added quietly, "My stepmother was not an easy person to please, Inspector. She had very definite opinions about what was proper and suitable. But she was also a woman of strong principles. Whatever has happened to her, she did not simply run away." It was this last comment that lingered in Miss Marple's mind as the formal interviews concluded. That afternoon, as she sat in her garden with her knitting, she found herself visited by Miss Isabel herself, who appeared at the garden gate looking drawn and anxious. "Miss Marple, I hope you'll forgive my presumption in calling upon you." the young woman began, accepting the offered chair and cup of tea with obvious gratitude. "But I feel I must speak to someone, and you have such a reputation for wisdom in these matters." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm as she encouraged the girl to continue. "Everyone seems so certain that Octavia has simply disappeared of her own accord, but I know her better than most. She would never abandon her responsibilities so carelessly. The estate, the servants, her various charitable committees. She took her duties very seriously indeed." Miss Isabel leaned forward earnestly. "There's something else. Something I haven't told Inspector Slack, because I wasn't certain of its significance. 3 days before the garden party, I overheard Octavia on the telephone. She was speaking to someone she clearly knew well. He called her Tavy, which was her childhood name. She was angry, angrier than I'd ever heard her. She kept saying things like, "You cannot possibly expect me to agree to such terms, and the consequences would be disastrous for everyone involved." This information caused Miss Marple's knitting to pause momentarily. "Did you recognize the caller's voice?" "No, but it was definitely a man, and from the way he spoke to her, someone who had known her for many years." The conversation ended quite abruptly, and Octavia was in a terrible mood for the rest of the day. As Miss Isabel took her leave, Miss Marple found herself with several new pieces to add to the puzzle. Lady Pringle had been under some form of pressure significant enough to make her angry and worried. Someone from her past had been making demands she found unacceptable. Yet she had not confided in anyone, not even her companion or her stepdaughter. The evening brought one final observation that Miss Marple filed away with the rest. Walking past the vicarage on her way to evening service, she noticed Inspector Slack in deep conversation with Owen Pike near the motor house. The chauffeur's posture was defensive, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. When he gestured, Miss Marple caught sight of his jacket cuff, where a small silver button was conspicuously missing, leaving only a few threads to mark its former place. As she continued on her way, Miss Marple reflected on the curious pattern that was beginning to emerge. Lady Pringle had vanished completely, yet she had left behind a trail of small inconsistencies and telling details that suggested her disappearance was neither random nor voluntary. Someone had taken considerable care to ensure she could not be easily found. Yet that same someone had been careless about the smaller details that might eventually lead back to them. The silver button found by young Timothy, the cornflower petal so far from its natural location, Owen Pike's missing button, and the scent of crushed flowers about his person. These were not the hallmarks of a professional crime, but rather the mistakes of someone operating under considerable stress and perhaps not entirely prepared for the complexity of their undertaking. Most significant of all was the growing certainty that Lady Pringle's disappearance was connected to her recent telephone conversation and the mysterious demands that had so angered her. Someone who knew her well enough to use her childhood nickname had been pressuring her about something she found completely unacceptable. Whether that pressure had escalated into something far more sinister remained to be seen, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the truth, when it emerged, would prove to be both more personal and more tragic than anyone yet imagined. The morning after Lady Pringle's disappearance brought Inspector Slack from Much Benham, along with an air of official gravity that settled over St. Mary Mead like morning mist. Miss Marple, taking her customary early walk to collect the post, observed how quickly the village had organized itself around theories that cast suspicion conveniently away from its own residents. Mrs. Price Ridley favored the traveling people who had departed days earlier, while Colonel Bantry pronounced with military certainty that the chauffeur Pike was obviously to blame. Inspector Slack established his headquarters in the vicarage study, the very room where Lady Pringle had last been seen. His methodical examination revealed no signs of struggle, confirming what the previous evening's search had suggested. Miss Finch provided her account with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every detail, while Owen Pike's testimony was briefer but equally significant in its nervous undertones. Miss Marple positioned herself unobtrusively near the window with her knitting, observing the interplay between witnesses with growing interest. She noted how Miss Finch's eyes darted toward Owen whenever Inspector Slack questioned him, and detected that faint scent of crushed flowers she had noticed the previous day. Not merely motor oil and leather, but something sweeter, reminiscent of sachets. The morning's first significant development came with the arrival of Mr. Pemberton, Lady Pringle's solicitor from Much Benham. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of haste, and his news cast the entire investigation in a new light. Lady Pringle had changed her will only the previous Tuesday, making substantial alterations to the main beneficiaries and including a sealed envelope with instructions that it should only be opened if anything untoward should befall her. "The timing is most extraordinary," Mrs. Clement confided to Miss Marple later. Miss Isabel was to receive a much larger portion than previously arranged, and there were new provisions for several people in the village. This revelation prompted Miss Marple to pay closer attention to Miss Finch's increasingly nervous behavior. When she encountered the companion outside the post office, fumbling with correspondence that included a letter from a London employment agency, the significance was not lost on her. Despite Miss Finch's protestations that Lady Pringle never discussed such matters with her, she seemed remarkably well informed about the will's existence and timing. Dr. Reeves's subsequent visit to Miss Marple provided additional crucial information. The inheritance arrangement was more complex than it had initially appeared. Miss Isabel was to receive her full inheritance only upon marriage or reaching 30, and Lady Pringle's opposition to the doctor's suit may have been financially motivated rather than merely social. Most intriguingly, Dr. Reeves revealed that 3 days before the garden party, Miss Isabel had received a letter from her father's former business partner, a Mr. Blackwood, requesting a meeting. Lady Pringle's extraordinarily agitated reaction to this news and her insistence that Blackwood was disreputable suggested connections to the mysterious telephone conversation Miss Isabel had overheard. The afternoon brought a discovery that shifted the investigation's focus entirely. Young Timothy Clement, searching for his cricket ball near the old mill pond, found a lady's glove of fine grey kid leather bearing Lady Pringle's monogram. The glove was damp but not waterlogged, with a small tear in the palm and dark stains on the fingertips. Most significantly, the mill pond lay nearly half a mile from the vicarage, well beyond the area that had been searched. Inspector Slack's attention, however, remained fixed on Owen Pike. The chauffeur's missing button, his evasive answers, and the discovery of what appeared to be a pressed cornflower in his cottage seemed to provide the neat resolution the inspector preferred. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the evidence was almost too convenient, too perfectly aligned. Walking past the vicarage on her way to evening service, she observed Inspector Slack in conversation with Owen Pike near the motor house. The chauffeur's defensive posture and the conspicuous gap where his silver button should have been confirmed the inspector's growing suspicion. But Miss Marple's attention was caught by subtler details, the way Miss Finch had cleaned Lady Pringle's desk before the police examined it, the employment agency letter, and the curious fact that Owen's jacket was kept where it would absorb lavender rather than motor oil. As evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from the day's revelations. Lady Pringle's recent will changes, occurring just after Mr. Blackwood's contact attempt, suggested she had anticipated some form of danger. The sealed envelope implied specific fears about particular consequences. Yet the physical evidence, the button, the glove, the cornflower petal, felt almost theatrical in their incriminating nature. Someone had indeed wanted Lady Pringle silenced, and that someone possessed detailed knowledge of both her movements and the local geography. The careful timing during the garden party, when alibis would be confused and attention diverted, spoke of considerable planning. But the small mistakes suggested the perpetrator was not as clever as they believed themselves to be. Most significantly, Miss Marple was becoming convinced that the truth lay not in Inspector Slack's preference for obvious suspects, but in the complex web of relationships and hidden motives that had been building long before that seemingly innocent afternoon gathering. The mysterious Mr. Blackwood, the inheritance arrangements, and the telephone conversation using Lady Pringle's childhood name all pointed to undercurrents of tension rooted in the past. The case against Owen Pike might satisfy Inspector Slack's desire for a swift resolution, but Miss Marple suspected that Lady Pringle's disappearance was the culmination of something far more personal and carefully orchestrated than a servant's resentment. The truth, when it emerged, would likely prove both more complex and more tragic than the inspector's tidy theories suggested. The morning after the mill pond discovery brought Inspector Slack and a team of constables armed with grappling hooks and poles. Miss Marple, accompanied by Mrs. Clement, positioned herself at a respectful distance among the meadow-sweetened nettles that bordered the dark water. The inspector's methodical approach to the search reflected his growing confidence that the case would soon reach a satisfactory conclusion. The first significant discovery emerged within the hour. Lady Pringle's hat, snagged on a reed near the far bank. The dove-grey felt with its cornflower trimming came up dripping, though Miss Marple noted with interest that the interior band remained surprisingly dry beneath the brim. A faint scent of lavender clung to the fabric, the clean, old-fashioned fragrance of airing cupboards and linen drawers. Most intriguingly, one of the cornflower petals was pinned incorrectly, tacked over instead of under in a manner that suggested hasty replacement rather than a lady's maid's careful attention. Inspector Slack received the hat with obvious satisfaction. "Well then, this confirms our direction," he declared, already composing his conclusions. "Either she came here voluntarily or was brought. The evidence speaks for itself." Owen Pike watched from the periphery, his shoulders rigid and his eyes following the hat's movement with the intensity of a man whose fate might hang upon such discoveries. Miss Finch, pale as parchment, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and turned away when Dr. Reeves approached to offer support. The chauffeur's obvious distress and the companion's evident agitation only served to reinforce Inspector Slack's growing certainty about the direction of his investigation. When the grappling hooks yielded nothing more substantial than pondweed and a rusted pail, the inspector called a temporary halt. "We'll return at low water," he informed his men. "There's a deep shelf that could take considerable time to search properly." Miss Marple, while Mrs. Clement offered comfort to the distraught Miss Finch, stooped to examine the soil near the water's edge. The dark, fine silt was characteristic of pond margins, clinging and distinctive. Her unobtrusive survey of the footwear around her revealed that Miss Finch's neat shoes were clean this morning, but just above the heel, where polish fades into stitching, pale, chalky dust clung. The distinctive residue from the lane that ran behind the mill, a path that would require deliberate effort to traverse. The morning's drama was interrupted by the arrival of young Timothy Clement, who approached Miss Marple with the conspiratorial air of someone bearing important intelligence. "I've been awfully careful, Miss Marple," he whispered, producing a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket. Within lay the silver button he had discovered by the climbing rose, its etched vine pattern catching the morning light. Miss Marple examined it thoughtfully, recalling her observations of Owen Pike's jacket buttons, plain affairs with simple milled rims that bore no resemblance to the ornate piece in her palm. By mid-morning, the village had organized its usual rituals of crisis management. Miss Marple volunteered to accompany Mrs. Clement with a basket of provisions for the staff at Pringle Hall, thus finding herself once again in Lady Pringle's study. The French doors remained open to the rose garden, and on the polished writing table, a small stain of cornflower blue marked the blotter where something damp and dyed had recently rested. Miss Finch flitted about the room with nervous energy, her explanations carrying a defensive edge that no one had accused her of needing. "I only thought to make things tidy for Inspector Slack's examination," she said, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted already perfect arrangements. Her ladyship was always particular about maintaining proper order. The afternoon brought an unexpected development that would prove crucial to the investigation's direction. Miss Finch, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the day, suffered what Dr. Reeves diplomatically termed a nervous collapse. Mrs. Clement discovered her in the rose garden, weeping hysterically while clutching a crumpled letter that bore a London postmark. The letter from the employment agency that had originally placed Miss Finch in Lady Pringle's service informed her that her position would terminate at month's end, as her employer had decided to make alternative household arrangements. The formal tone and specific language suggested not dismissal for misconduct, but rather a planned reorganization that Lady Pringle had been contemplating for some time. Between sobs, Miss Finch revealed information that cast the entire situation in a more complex light. Lady Pringle had recently received several visits from a well-dressed gentleman with graying hair who insisted on private meetings. She was always agitated after he called, Miss Finch whispered, and she began locking her desk, something she had never done before. She even started carrying her jewelry case to her room each night, as if she feared theft. This revelation coincided with additional intelligence that Miss Marple had quietly gathered from Miss Wren at the telephone exchange. The conscientious operator, after suitable encouragement about the importance of discretion, revealed that Pringle Hall had placed 2 significant calls in recent days. One to a London firm called Blackwood and Associates, and another to the Crown Hotel in Much Benham, requesting connection to a Mr. Gray. The connection between these 2 names suggested the kind of deliberate obfuscation that Miss Marple had encountered in previous cases involving individuals who preferred to remain less visible than their activities warranted. If Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Gray were indeed the same person, it would explain both the familiarity of the Tavy address and the urgency surrounding the recent communications. Further confirmation came from an unexpected source. Mr. Giles, a local farmer whose property bordered the Mill Pond area, reported seeing a dark blue saloon car parked on the seldom-used lane beyond the pond on the afternoon of the garden party. He had observed a tall, sharply dressed man pacing beside the vehicle with obvious agitation, though the distance had prevented clear identification. Miss Isabel, when gently questioned about her knowledge of Mr. Blackwood, provided the final pieces of this particular puzzle. Her father's former business partner had indeed been a source of considerable anxiety for Lady Pringle, who had described him as a scheming rat involved in questionable dealings during the India years. Most significantly, Miss Isabel recalled an incident when Lady Pringle had discovered an old photograph of Blackwood among her late husband's papers and had thrown it into the fire with considerable vehemence. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself with a clearer picture of the forces that had been converging upon Lady Pringle in her final days. The mysterious Mr. Blackwood had clearly been exerting pressure regarding some past scandal, pressure significant enough to prompt changes to her will and household arrangements. The physical evidence, the strategically placed button, the conveniently discovered glove, the cornflower petal so far from its natural habitat, began to appear less like genuine clues and more like carefully constructed misdirection. Inspector Slack's growing focus on Owen Pike, while understandable given the surface evidence, seemed increasingly misguided to Miss Marple's experienced eye. The real perpetrator had demonstrated considerable sophistication in orchestrating both the disappearance and the subsequent investigation's direction. Someone had understood human nature well enough to manipulate it effectively, creating a trail of evidence that would satisfy a competent but unimaginative police officer while concealing their own involvement behind a facade of respectability. The case was approaching a critical juncture, and Miss Marple suspected that the next development would reveal whether her growing theory about the true nature of Lady Pringle's disappearance would prove correct. Someone in St. Mary Mead was harboring a dangerous secret, and their carefully constructed deception was beginning to show the small cracks that would eventually lead to its complete unraveling. The morning after the Mill Pond discovery brought Inspector Slack and his team back to the dark water with grappling hooks and systematic determination. Miss Marple, accompanied by Mrs. Clement, positioned herself among the meadow suite at a respectful distance, observing both the search and the reactions of those who had gathered to witness it. The recovery of Lady Pringle's hat within the first hour seemed to vindicate the inspector's methodical approach, though Miss Marple noted several curious details about the waterlogged felt that others overlooked. The dove-grey hat with its cornflower trimming emerged dripping from the reeds, yet the interior band remained surprisingly dry beneath the brim. A faint scent of lavender clung to the fabric, and one of the decorative cornflowers had been pinned incorrectly, tacked over instead of under in a manner that suggested hasty replacement rather than a lady's maid's careful attention. Miss Marple filed these observations away with her customary discretion, while Inspector Slack proclaimed the discovery as confirmation of his theory. The morning's drama was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Pemberton, Lady Pringle's solicitor, bearing the sealed envelope that would transform the entire investigation. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of haste as he explained that Lady Pringle had deposited the envelope with specific instructions that it should be opened only if something untoward befell her. Given the circumstances, Inspector Slack agreed that the present situation certainly qualified. They assembled in Pringle Hall's library for the reading. Inspector Slack, Mr. Pemberton, Miss Isabel, Dr. Reeves, and Miss Finch, who appeared pale and increasingly agitated. Miss Marple, having been invited by Mrs. Clement to assist with arrangements, positioned herself unobtrusively in a corner chair with her knitting. The envelope's contents proved both illuminating and deeply troubling. Lady Pringle's letter, written in her characteristic brisk style, detailed months of increasingly threatening communications from a man who called himself Gray, but whom she had known as Bartholomew Blackwood during her husband's business dealings in India. Blackwood was demanding the return of documents and a substantial sum of money, claiming that Sir Reginald had defrauded him of his rightful share in a mining venture. The letter made clear Lady Pringle's belief that these claims were fraudulent, but acknowledged that public exposure of the allegations would destroy both her reputation and Miss Isabel's future prospects. Most significantly, the letter revealed that Lady Pringle had arranged to meet Blackwood on the afternoon of the garden party, intending to confront him with evidence of his criminal activities. She had discovered through private inquiry that he had served time for fraud and was currently wanted by authorities in Ceylon. Her plan was to threaten him with exposure unless he ceased his demands entirely. Miss Finch gave an involuntary start when the letter mentioned concerns about listeners at doors within the household, then busied herself unnecessarily with the already perfect arrangement of papers on a side table. Inspector Slack, catching the movement, briefly shifted his attention from Owen Pike before returning to his preferred theory. The revelation provided him with both motive and opportunity for a crime that extended beyond local jurisdiction, though it failed to explain Lady Pringle's complete disappearance. The afternoon brought Miss Marple an opportunity to examine the Daimler more closely. Owen Pike, sullen but cooperative, unlocked the vehicle at her polite request. The interior carried the expected sense of leather and polish, but it was the tiniest detail that proved most significant. A minute shred of dove-grey felt caught where the door met its hinge, and just beyond it, the faintest bloom of cornflower blue. A smudged trace of dye on the painted metal. The evidence suggested that Lady Pringle's hat had been inside the motor car, contradicting the theory that she had walked to the mill pond of her own accord. Young Timothy Clement's arrival with the silver button he had discovered provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple examined it carefully, noting its ornate vine pattern and quality craftsmanship, entirely different from the simple utilitarian buttons on Owen Pike's work jacket. The discrepancy was glaring to anyone who looked closely, yet Inspector Slack seemed determined to fit the evidence to his preferred narrative. Further inquiries at the Crown Hotel in Much Benham revealed that, while no Bartholomew Gray had registered, the desk clerk recalled a well-dressed gentleman with graying hair who had made several telephone calls from the lobby. More significantly, the hotel's chambermaid remembered the gentleman meeting with a thin, nervous lady who, kept looking at the door, and had lavender about her. The description fitted Miss Finch perfectly, and the maid's recollection of an envelope changing hands added another layer to the growing web of deception. Miss Marple's gentle questioning of the local taxi driver, Mr. Dobbs, confirmed her suspicions. He distinctly remembered taking a nervous lady to the lane near the mill pond on the afternoon of the garden party, someone who had asked to be set down before reaching her destination and had walked the remainder of the way. The passenger's description, neat hat, narrow shoulders, and that unmistakable scent of lavender, left little doubt about her identity. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself with a clearer picture of the forces that had converged on that seemingly peaceful garden party afternoon. Lady Pringle had indeed planned to confront Blackwood, but someone else had orchestrated a far more permanent solution to the problem he represented. The physical evidence, the strategically placed button, the conveniently discovered hat, the cornflower petal so far from its natural habitat, began to appear less like genuine clues and more like carefully constructed misdirection. Miss Finch's behavior throughout the day had been particularly revealing. Her nervous energy, her defensive explanations for actions no one had questioned, and her obvious relief when Inspector Slack focused his attention on Owen Pike all pointed to someone desperately trying to maintain a facade while concealing deeper involvement. The employment agency letter, the hotel meeting, the taxi ride to the mill, pond, each piece fit into a pattern that suggested not coincidence, but careful planning. The case against Owen Pike might satisfy Inspector Slack's desire for a swift resolution, but Miss Marple was becoming increasingly convinced that the real perpetrator had demonstrated considerable sophistication in manipulating both the crime scene and the subsequent investigation. Someone had understood human nature well enough to create a trail of evidence that would satisfy a competent but unimaginative police officer, while concealing their own involvement behind a facade of nervous respectability. Most troubling was the growing certainty that Lady Pringle's fate had been sealed not by a stranger's greed, but by someone within her own household, someone who had intimate knowledge of her habits, her fears, and her plans. The mysterious Mr. Blackwood might have provided the motive, but Miss Marple suspected that the means and opportunity had come from much closer to home. The truth, when it finally emerged, would likely prove both more personal and more tragic than Inspector Slack's tidy theories suggested. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human capacity for self-deception. Everyone involved seemed determined to believe in explanations that cast suspicion away from themselves and their immediate circle. Yet the evidence, when examined with sufficient care and objectivity, pointed inexorably toward a conclusion that would shatter the comfortable assumptions of village life. Someone in St. Mary Mead was harboring a dangerous secret, and their carefully constructed deception was beginning to show the small but telling cracks that would eventually lead to its complete unraveling. The morning after Lady Pringle's sealed letter had revealed the true nature of Blackwood's threats, Miss Marple set about her errands with the unhurried calm that always put others at ease. Her path took her, quite naturally, past Chitwick's drapery and fancy goods, where Mr. Chitwick greeted her with the deference due to a steady customer. A few mild questions about gentlemen's notions, purely out of solicitude for a nephew's mending, she murmured, brought forth a small triumph from beneath the counter. Silver buttons of that pattern? Mr. Chitwick adjusted his spectacles as he examined the sample Miss Marple described. Only one set sold recently, Miss Marple. Ordered a fortnight ago by a gentleman who gave his name as Gray. Staying at the Crown, he said. Expensive work and particular about the engraving. Vine leaves, he specified. Had to send to London for the craftsmanship. Miss Marple examined the remaining sample with satisfaction. The etched vine pattern matched exactly what young Timothy had discovered by the climbing rose. Most significantly, Mr. Chitwick produced the original order slip bearing the desk clerk's notation, Gray, Crown Hotel. When she reached Pringle Hall, Mrs. Clement's charitable nature had, already secured her admission to assist with arrangements. Miss Marple found herself once again in Lady Pringle's study, where the French doors stood open to the rose garden, and a light breeze stirred the curtains. Taking up an ordinary pencil from the desk, she ran it with delicate strokes across the blotter, watching as the faint impressions of previous writing gradually emerged beneath the graphite. The ghost of Lady Pringle's final appointment became visible. Mr. Gray, 345 side gate, and beneath it, in the same decisive hand, the word alone. The evidence confirmed that Lady Pringle had indeed planned to meet her tormentor, but it also revealed her determination to face him without witnesses, a decision that may have sealed her fate. Owen Pike, when Miss Marple encountered him polishing the Daimler, proved more forthcoming than his previous sullen demeanor had suggested. Her gentle request for a seat while she caught her breath provided the perfect opportunity to examine the vehicle more closely. The faint smear of cornflower blue she had noticed previously remained visible near the door hinge, and her casual admiration of the motorcar's finish drew an unexpected response from the chauffeur. Miss Finch put a parcel on the back seat that afternoon, he admitted reluctantly, his defensiveness giving way to obvious bewilderment. Told me not to dawdle at the side gate when her ladyship came out. Said it was something for her ladyship, but it smelled of lavender, not like her usual things. This revelation provided another piece of the puzzle. Miss Finch had been actively involved in the afternoon's arrangements, placing items in the Daimler and giving specific instructions about timing and location. The lavender scent, so characteristic of the companion's person, suggested that whatever she had placed in the motorcar had come from her own possessions. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. Mr. Bartholomew Blackwood himself, appearing at her garden gate with the nervous energy of a man operating under considerable strain. His request for a private conversation was delivered with careful courtesy, though his eyes darted toward the windows as if expecting unwelcome observers. Blackwood's account painted a picture far more complex than Inspector Slack's theories suggested. Yes, he had been pressing Lady Pringle for documents and restitution, but his claims were legitimate, evidence that her late husband had systematically defrauded him during their partnership in Ceylon. The charges that had sent him to prison had been fabricated to conceal Sir Reginald's embezzlement, and Lady Pringle possessed the documents that could clear his name. "I waited at the mill pond for nearly an hour," he explained, his hands clenched tightly. "Lady Pringle never appeared, but I did observe someone else in the vicinity, a figure in dark clothing who emerged from the mill pond path and disappeared into the woods before I could identify them clearly." Most significantly, Blackwood produced a letter he had received that morning, bearing a local postmark but no signature. The message was brief but chilling. "Lady Pringle will not be attending any more meetings. Your business with the Pringle family is concluded. Leave the district immediately or face the consequences." Miss Marple examined the anonymous letter carefully, noting the expensive stationery and the deliberate attempt to disguise the handwriting. Most telling was the faint scent of lavender that clung to the paper, the same clean fragrance she had detected throughout her investigation. Following Blackwood's departure, Miss Marple's gentle inquiries around the village revealed additional disturbing information. Miss Finch had been making urgent travel arrangements, inquiring about the earliest trains to London and connections to continental services. More significantly, the postmistress revealed that the companion had been receiving regular correspondence from Hartwell and Associates, a London firm known for handling delicate inheritance disputes, not the employment agency she had claimed. When Miss Marple encountered Miss Finch at the village shop that afternoon, the companion's behavior had become increasingly erratic. She jumped at unexpected sounds, purchased items she clearly didn't need, and made contradictory statements about her immediate plans. Her mention of terrible nightmares and sleeplessness since the disappearance suggested someone operating under enormous psychological strain. The evening brought Miss Marple to the Mill Pond Lane, where her careful examination revealed additional evidence. At the bend where the taxi driver had deposited his nervous passenger, she found a small abrasion in the hedge and, in a patch of lingering dampness, the clear impression of a feminine shoe with a distinctive nick at the outer edge, the same mark she had observed on Miss Finch's footwear. As darkness fell, Miss Marple positioned herself behind a gap in the hedge she had discovered during previous walks. Her patience was rewarded when two figures appeared, moving cautiously along the verge toward the pond. Even at a distance, Miss Finch's pale, nervous face was unmistakable, and beside her walked a taller figure who spoke in the confident, irritated tones of someone whose careful arrangements had required unwelcome modifications. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, fixing in her memory the fact of their meeting and the measure of their obvious anxiety. When they departed, she understood that something at the mill pond required their continued attention, evidence that needed adjustment or removal before Inspector Slack's investigation could discover it. The pattern was finally becoming clear. Miss Finch had not merely been Lady Pringle's victim or Blackwood's unwilling accomplice, but rather the architect of an elaborate deception that used their conflict as cover for her own desperate scheme. The companion's access to Lady Pringle's private correspondence, her knowledge of household routines, and her ability to manipulate both the meeting arrangements and the subsequent investigation had made her the perfect perpetrator of a crime that appeared to implicate everyone except herself. The question that remained was whether Lady Pringle was still alive, hidden until Miss Finch could complete whatever plan she had set in motion, or whether the companion's increasingly desperate behavior stemmed from knowledge that she had already crossed an irreversible line. The anonymous letter to Blackwood suggested confidence, but Miss Finch's obvious preparations for flight indicated someone who understood that her carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel. Miss Marple walked home through the gathering darkness, certain that the truth would emerge very soon. The small, stubborn facts she had so patiently collected were beginning to speak with unmistakable clarity, and Miss Finch's elaborate web of lies and misdirection would not survive much longer under the gentle but relentless pressure of careful observation and quiet persistence. The morning after her nocturnal observation brought Miss Marple back to the mill pond with the unhurried persistence that had served her well in previous investigations. The dew lay heavy on the grass, and in the early light she could see more clearly what the darkness had concealed. Two distinct sets of footprints led from the lane to the water's edge, one showing the narrow, pointed impression of feminine shoes, the other broader and suggesting a man's Oxford. More significantly, the grass near the willow showed signs of recent disturbance, as if something heavy had been dragged to the water and then repositioned. Her careful examination of the hedge where she had concealed herself the previous evening yielded a small but telling discovery. Caught on a thorn was a fragment of expensive cream paper, its decal edge bearing the partial impression of a London firm's letterhead. The remaining letters, well and as, were quite sufficient for identification, and the faint scent of lavender that clung to the paper confirmed her growing suspicions about its source. When Inspector Slack arrived with his men, summoned by Miss Marple's quiet message, they found additional evidence that transformed the investigation's direction entirely. Wedged beneath the willow's overhanging roots was a leather carpet bag, weighted with stones and bound with what appeared to be curtain cord. The bag's contents told a deliberate story: a grey cloak of good quality, walking shoes stuffed with rocks, a second kid glove to match Timothy's discovery, and a small lavender sachet with its blue ribbon bleeding colour into the dark water. Most significantly, the bag contained fragments of correspondence in Lady Pringle's unmistakable hand, though whole sheets had been torn away, and a folded list of names that included several village residents. The arrangement suggested a drowning convincingly staged, with evidence carefully distributed to support the desired conclusion while pointing suspicion in multiple directions. Inspector Slack examined the curtain cord with growing satisfaction, recognizing it as matching the morning room draperies at Pringle Hall. "This settles the direction of our inquiry," he declared, though Miss Marple noted with interest the cord's neat knots. precise, clerk-like ties rather than the rougher work of someone accustomed to manual labor. The ends showed traces of dark green sealing wax, the same type she had observed Mrs. Clement borrowing from Pringle Hall for parish notices. Their return to Pringle Hall found the household in a state of barely controlled tension. Miss Finch sat at the writing table, pale and motionless, as if her emotions had crystallized into something brittle. Before her lay an invoice from Hartwell and Associates bearing a penciled notation in her nervous hand. Reply today. The employment agency correspondence had been replaced by communications from a firm known for handling delicate inheritance disputes, a detail that cast her previous explanations in an entirely different light. Owen Pike, who had been lurking in the passages with the aimless anxiety of a man expecting accusation, retreated at Inspector Slack's approach. Miss Isabel, summoned from the morning room, maintained her composure with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from adult behavior. The morning's questioning revealed Miss Finch's increasing inability to maintain her carefully constructed narrative. Her responses came slowly, each word chosen with the deliberation of someone navigating a field of hidden traps. She acknowledged the lavender sachets as her own, but denied any knowledge of carpetbags or mill pond excursions. Most tellingly, her eyes followed Inspector Slack's movements with the intensity of someone whose fate hung upon his conclusions, while her hands betrayed a tremor that suggested nerves stretched beyond their capacity. The arrival of Mr. Pemberton with urgent legal business interrupted the interrogation at a crucial moment. The solicitor entered with forced briskness, carrying a folded document like a trophy. "Inspector, I have discovered a codicil," he announced, executed the day before the garden party, most irregularly placed in Lady Pringle's locked desk. The codicil appeared straightforward. Increased provisions for Miss Isabel upon marriage, reduced charitable bequests, and a small annuity for Miss Finch, conditional upon remaining in service for 12 additional months. On its surface, it provided both motive and constraint for a nervous companion facing dismissal. Yet Miss Marple, examining the document as it passed among them, noted several curious details that others overlooked. The typewriter ribbon had been fresh for some portions and worn for others, creating an inconsistent impression that suggested the document had been prepared in stages. More significantly, a faint blue smear near the margin indicated that something damp and doid, perhaps a lavender sachet, had rested on the paper before the ink had fully dried. The letter E showed the characteristic progression from sharp to clogged that she had observed on the Hall's own machine during Mrs. Clement's typing sessions. Miss Isabel's quiet intervention added another layer of complexity to the proceedings. Lady Pringle had mentioned altering Miss Finch's arrangements, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. She told me on Thursday that she intended to provide for her differently, though she didn't specify how. She said she would inform Mr. Pemberton after the garden party. Mr. Pemberton's professional smile remained fixed, though Miss Marple observed how his hand moved unconsciously to adjust his waistcoat. The silver buttons that adorned it caught the morning light, their intricate vine pattern clearly visible, except for the third from the bottom, where only threads remained to mark a recent loss. The empty space seemed to draw attention despite his attempt to conceal it with casual gestures. The afternoon brought news that cast the entire investigation in a more urgent light. Mr. Blackwood had been discovered near the Crown Hotel, semi-conscious and bleeding from a head wound. Dr. Reeves, summoned to treat him, reported that the injured man had been muttering about Gray and insisting repeatedly that the lawyer was responsible. The attack suggested that someone was growing desperate to silence voices that might contradict their carefully constructed narrative. When Miss Marple encountered Mr. Pemberton later that day, ostensibly by chance near the post office, she noted how his usual confidence had given way to nervous energy. His inquiries about the morning's postal deliveries and his obvious relief when assured that no London correspondence had arrived suggested someone expecting communications he preferred to intercept. Most significantly, when she mentioned the distinctive silver buttons that Mr. Chitwick had ordered for the mysterious Mr. Gray, Pemberton's reaction was swift and telling, a quick glance at his waistcoat followed by an immediate attempt to redirect the conversation. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was emerging with increasing clarity. The physical evidence at the mill pond had been carefully arranged to suggest Lady Pringle's death while providing multiple suspects for investigation. Miss Finch's obvious distress and financial desperation made her an ideal scapegoat, while Owen Pike's working-class status and access to the motor car provided alternative theories for Inspector Slack's consideration. Yet the small details continued to point towards someone with more sophisticated knowledge of legal procedures and financial manipulation. The forged codicil, the strategic placement of evidence, and the systematic attempt to eliminate inconvenient witnesses all suggested a mind comfortable with complex deception. Mr. Pemberton's missing button, his nervous behavior, and his convenient discovery of documents that supported the desired narrative created a picture of someone who had overestimated his own cleverness while underestimating the power of careful observation. The attack on Blackwood represented a dangerous escalation that suggested the perpetrator was losing control of their carefully orchestrated plan. Someone who had begun with subtle manipulation was now resorting to violence, a progression that Miss Marple had observed in previous cases involving individuals whose initial success had bred dangerous overconfidence. Most concerning was the growing certainty that Lady Pringle's fate remained unknown. The staged evidence at the mill pond might have been designed to suggest her death, but Miss Marple suspected that the truth was both more complex and more immediate than anyone yet realized. Someone in St. Mary Mead possessed knowledge of Lady Pringle's actual whereabouts, and their increasingly desperate behavior suggested that time was running short for both concealment and rescue. As she prepared for what she sensed would be the investigation's crucial phase, Miss Marple considered the curious human tendency to believe that intelligence alone could overcome the accumulated weight of small, persistent truths. Someone had constructed an elaborate deception, but they had failed to account for the simple fact that lies, however cleverly told, eventually contradicted themselves in ways that careful observation could detect and patient inquiry could expose. The morning would bring new developments, she was certain, and with them the opportunity to test her growing theory against the reality of human nature under pressure. In her experience, the most dangerous moment in any investigation came when the guilty party realized that their careful plans were unraveling. A realization that could prompt either confession or a final, desperate attempt to silence the truth forever. The morning after the attack brought Dr. Reeves's report that Mr. Blackwood had recovered sufficiently to provide a clearer account of his assault. Miss Marple found him propped against pillows in the small room above the surgery, his head bandaged but his eyes alert with the particular intensity of a man who had narrowly escaped something worse than mere robbery. "He knew my name," Blackwood said, accepting the cup of tea Mrs. Clement had thoughtfully provided. "Called me Bartholomew before he struck. Not the sort of familiarity one expects from a common thief. The voice was educated, precise. A gentleman's diction, if you take my meaning. And there was something about his waistcoat, silver buttons with an intricate pattern that caught the lamplight. Vine leaves, I think, though I was rather preoccupied with other matters at the time." Inspector Slack, who had arrived with his notebook at the ready, seized upon this detail with obvious satisfaction. "Vine leaves, you say? That matches the button found at the scene of Lady Pringle's disappearance. We're making progress, gentlemen." Miss Marple, however, found herself thinking not of Owen Pike's plain work buttons, but of the ornate fastenings she had observed on Mr. Pemberton's waistcoat, particularly the conspicuous gap where one had recently gone missing. When Blackwood added that his attacker had taken papers rather than valuables, specifically the correspondence he had intended to show Lady Pringle, The picture became clearer still. The morning's second revelation came from Mrs. Clement's charitable rounds at Pringle Hall. Miss Finch had been discovered before dawn, burning papers in the study fireplace with such urgency that smoke had filled the room and alarmed the remaining staff. The documents she had attempted to destroy included drafts of legal correspondence and what appeared to be practice attempts at Lady Pringle's signature, sheets covered with careful forgeries that grew progressively more confident. Most significantly, the Hall's typewriter revealed its secrets under Miss Marple's gentle examination. The machine showed the characteristic progression of the letter E from sharp to clogged that she had noted on the suspicious codicil, and a few experimental lines confirmed that this was indeed where the document had been prepared. The faint blue smear on the codicil's margin, when compared to the lavender sachets Miss Finch kept throughout the house, told its own story of hasty preparation and nervous oversight. When Miss Marple encountered Mr. Pemberton later that morning, his transformation was immediately apparent. Gone was the confident professional demeanor. In its place was a man who started at unexpected sounds and whose hands showed the telltale tremor of someone operating under enormous strain. His gloves, worn despite the mild weather, could not entirely conceal the gap where his distinctive silver button should have been. Such beautiful craftsmanship in gentlemen's waistcoat buttons these days, Miss Marple observed with gentle admiration as they passed in the village street. Mr. Chitwick was telling me about a particularly fine set he ordered recently. Vine leaves, I believe, for a gentleman who called himself Grey. Such an interesting coincidence, given poor Mr. Blackwood's description of his attacker. The effect was immediate and telling. Pemberton's face drained of color, and his carefully prepared explanation about purchasing the waistcoat years earlier contradicted Mr. Chitwick's specific recollection of the recent commission. The solicitor's obvious discomfort when faced with this discrepancy spoke volumes about his involvement in events he had hoped to keep concealed. The afternoon brought Miss Marple to an understanding of the conspiracy's true scope. Her patient observation revealed that Miss Finch and Mr. Pemberton had been meeting regularly, using the abandoned sections of Pringle Hall for conferences that required absolute privacy. The old laundry beyond the U-walk showed signs of recent use, fresh lamp oil, disturbed dust patterns, and that persistent scent of lavender that had become Miss Finch's unwitting signature throughout the investigation. Most significantly, Miss Isabel's innocent mention that Miss Finch held keys to all the unused portions of the estate provided the final piece of a disturbing puzzle. The companion's access to forgotten rooms and outbuildings, combined with her intimate knowledge of Lady Pringle's habits and the solicitor's legal expertise, had created the perfect conditions for a crime that used genuine conflicts as cover for more sinister purposes. When Miss Marple observed Owen Pike carrying paraffin to the old laundry at Miss Finch's request, only to see the companion return the key unused shortly afterward, she understood that something in those abandoned rooms required careful management. The nervous energy with which Miss Finch approached any mention of the estate's unused buildings suggested someone guarding a secret that grew more dangerous with each passing day. Inspector Slack's growing focus on Owen Pike, while understandable given the surface evidence, seemed increasingly misguided as the true pattern emerged. The forged codicil, the planted evidence at the mill pond, in the systematic attempt to eliminate inconvenient witnesses, all pointed to minds comfortable with complex deception and familiar with the procedures necessary to manipulate both investigations and inheritances. As evening approached, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the movements around Pringle Hall's more remote buildings. Her patience was rewarded when two figures emerged from the old laundry, moving with the careful stealth of people engaged in activities they preferred to keep hidden. Even at a distance, Miss Finch's narrow silhouette was unmistakable, and beside her walked a taller figure whose bearing and dress suggested professional authority rather than manual labor. The conversation she glimpsed through the gathering dusk carried the urgent undertones of a plan under strain. While she could not make out specific words, the body language spoke clearly of disagreement and growing desperation. Most telling was the way both figures repeatedly glanced toward the main house, as if expecting discovery at any moment. Walking home through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the curious evolution of the case from mysterious disappearance to elaborate conspiracy. Someone had orchestrated Lady Pringle's vanishing with considerable sophistication, using the conflicts between Blackwood and the family as perfect misdirection while pursuing their own agenda. The question that remained was whether Lady Pringle was still alive, hidden somewhere while her supposed death was being established through carefully manufactured evidence. The secret meetings at the old laundry, Miss Finch's preparations for flight, and Pemberton's increasingly desperate behavior all suggested a plan that had grown beyond its creator's ability to control. The attack on Blackwood represented a dangerous escalation that spoke of people who had committed themselves too deeply to retreat, yet lacked the ruthlessness to see their scheme through to its logical conclusion. Most concerning was the growing certainty that time was running short for everyone involved. The conspirators' elaborate web of lies and misdirection was beginning to unravel under the accumulated weight of small, persistent truths. Miss Marple suspected that the next 24 hours would bring either confession or a final, desperate attempt to silence the voices that threatened to expose the full extent of their deception. As she prepared for what she sensed would be the investigation's climactic phase, Miss Marple considered the curious human tendency to believe that cleverness alone could overcome the simple power of patient observation. Someone had constructed an intricate deception, but they had failed to account for the fact that lies, however skillfully told, eventually contradicted themselves in ways that careful attention could detect and gentle persistence could expose. The truth, when it finally emerged, would likely prove both more personal and more tragic than anyone yet imagined. The morning after her nocturnal observations brought Miss Marple to a decision that would test her growing theory against the reality of human nature under extreme pressure. She began, as was her custom, with the gentlest possible intervention. A quiet word with Mrs. Clement over morning tea about Inspector Slack's intention to conduct a thorough search of all outbuildings at Pringle Hall the following day. Such a thorough man, the inspector, Miss Marple observed with mild approval, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. He mentioned the old laundry particularly, and even that disused wing beyond the U-walk. Of course, if there were anything of a personal nature in those rooms, old correspondence or family documents, it would be kinder for the household to attend to such matters privately before the official search. Mrs. Clement, with her charitable heart and unfortunate tendency toward well-meaning gossip, received this information with the gravity it deserved. By mid-morning, Miss Marple was confident that her gentle hint would find its way to the appropriate ears through the invisible network of village communication. She positioned herself on the bench near the lane that overlooked the U-walk, ostensibly enjoying the morning air with her mending basket. The elder and hawthorn provided perfect concealment while allowing clear observation of the path to the abandoned buildings. Her patience was rewarded within the hour when Miss Finch appeared, moving with the brittle urgency of someone whose carefully maintained composure was beginning to fracture. The companion's hands trembled so violently as she extracted the key from her reticule that she was forced to pause and steady herself against the old brick wall. Behind her, at a carefully maintained distance, came Mr. Pemberton, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. The missing silver button on his waistcoat caught Miss Marple's attention once again, a small detail that spoke volumes about the pressure under which he was operating. Miss Marple rose with deliberate casualness, making herself visible to any observer while directing her steps toward the kitchen garden. By the time she reached the herb beds, the soft echo of a door opening in the old laundry had drifted across the still air, followed by the gentle clink of a lamp being set down and what might have been a quickly stifled sob. The afternoon brought her the opportunity she had been waiting for. Finding Miss Isabel in the morning room, pale and distracted with worry, Miss Marple made her request with the perfect combination of frailty and determination that no well-bred young woman could refuse. Might Miss Isabel help her collect some kindling from the old laundry? The maid had been sent on an errand, and Mrs. Clement had promised a cheerful fire for her cold hands. They met the scent of lavender halfway down the yew walk, sharp and unmistakable, overlaying the stale dampness that clung to long unused rooms. The laundry door yielded to Miss Isabel's key with a reluctant groan that seemed to echo in the stillness. Inside, dust lay where it should have lain undisturbed for months, except along a narrow path where recent footprints had turned the powder into a smudged track. A hurricaned lamp stood on the trestle table, its flame burning low but steady. Beside it sat a delicate china cup and saucer bearing the unmistakable coral imprint of lipstick, Lady Pringle's particular shade, the same she had worn to the garden party. The sight of these intimate, personal items in the abandoned room created an atmosphere of profound unease. "Octavia," Miss Isabel whispered into the dimness, hope and dread warring in her voice. Miss Marple touched her arm gently. "Keep your voice low, my dear. I believe we may learn more by observing than by calling attention to ourselves." Her experienced eye took in the details that others might have missed. The cup was positioned precisely in the center of its saucer, suggesting someone who maintained habits of propriety even under duress. A small pile of Bath Oliver biscuits on a plate nearby showed signs of having been nibbled rather than consumed with appetite. Most significantly, a handkerchief bearing Lady Pringle's monogram lay folded on a wooden chair, faintly scented with lavender and something sharper, eau de cologne of the type used to revive ladies after faintness. Miss Marple's investigation of the room revealed additional evidence of recent occupation. The bank of old ironing cupboards along the far wall showed signs of having been disturbed, with one door bearing a fresh smear at the edge of its hinge. Dove-gray silk fibers that matched Lady Pringle's garden party dress. When gentle pressure revealed a concealed latch, a narrow panel swung inward to reveal a small space that had clearly served as a hiding place. The chamber beyond was empty now, but it told its story clearly. A chair with a folded rug, a wicker hamper, and the lingering scent of fear and lavender water spoke of someone who had been kept there against their will. The dust on the floor had been hastily swept, but Miss Marple's keen eye detected the telltale traces that careless cleaning always left behind, green threads and broken sealing wax that matched the evidence found at the mill pond. "They've moved her," Miss Isabel breathed, the words carrying both relief and renewed anxiety. "She's alive, but they've moved her somewhere else." Miss Marple closed the panel carefully, leaving the room as nearly as possible as they had found it. As they made their way back toward the house by a circuitous route, she reflected on the pattern that was finally becoming clear. The conspirators were growing desperate, their elaborate deception beginning to unravel under the accumulated weight of small inconsistencies and mounting pressure. The discovery in the old laundry confirmed her theory that Lady Pringle had been hidden rather than murdered, but it also revealed the dangerous instability of the situation. Miss Finch and Mr. Pemberton had clearly been forced to relocate their prisoner, suggesting that their original plan was failing and that they were making increasingly desperate adjustments. As evening approached, Miss Marple prepared for what she sensed would be the investigation's final phase. The conspirators' behavior suggested people who had committed themselves too deeply to retreat, yet lacked the ruthlessness necessary to see their scheme through to its logical conclusion. The attack on Mr. Blackwood had been a dangerous escalation, and the continued imprisonment of Lady Pringle represented a crime that grew more serious with each passing hour. Most concerning was the growing certainty that time was running short for everyone involved. The physical evidence of Lady Pringle's recent presence in the old laundry, combined with the obvious signs that she had been moved again, suggested that the conspirators were approaching a critical decision point. Whether that decision would lead to Lady Pringle's safe release or to something far more permanent remained to be seen. Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, her mind already turning to the delicate task of forcing the truth into the open without precipitating the very tragedy she hoped to prevent. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that desperate people were capable of desperate acts, and that the final moments of any deception were often the most dangerous for everyone involved. The morning would bring new challenges, she was certain, and with them the opportunity to test her understanding of the case against the reality of guilt, fear, and the fundamental human desire for self-preservation. The truth was finally within reach, but extracting it safely would require all of her accumulated wisdom about the complex and often contradictory nature of the human heart. The morning after her discovery in the old laundry brought Miss Marple to the delicate task of forcing the truth into the open without precipitating the very tragedy she hoped to prevent. She began with a seemingly innocent visit to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was arranging flowers for the evening service. The morning light streaming through the windows created the perfect atmosphere for what Miss Marple privately thought of as her final test of human nature under pressure. Inspector Slack arrived shortly after 10, his notebook at the ready and his manner suggesting a man who believed himself close to a resolution. Miss Marple positioned herself in the corner chair with her knitting, appearing to doze while actually observing every detail of the interactions that would follow. When Miss Finch appeared at the door, ostensibly to return a borrowed prayer book, Miss Marple knew the crucial moment had arrived. Such a comfort, these little rituals, Miss Marple murmured as Miss Finch entered, her pale face showing the strain of sleepless nights. I was just telling Mrs. Clement about my dear nephew's experience with a rather troubling case involving forged documents. It's remarkable how the smallest details can betray even the most careful deception. A typewriter ribbon that shows inconsistent wear, for instance, or handwriting that grows more confident with practice. Miss Finch's hand trembled as she set down the prayer book, and Miss Marple noted with interest how the companion's eyes darted toward the window as if expecting unwelcome visitors. The nervous energy that had characterized her behavior for days was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. When Mr. Pemberton arrived minutes later, claiming urgent business with the vicar about estate matters, Miss Marple understood that her gentle pressure was beginning to have its desired effect. The solicitor's usually immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of strain, his gloves worn despite the mild weather, his waistcoat buttoned incorrectly to conceal the missing silver button, and a nervous habit of checking his watch that suggested a man operating under considerable time pressure. I've always found it curious, Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm, how people will sometimes go to extraordinary lengths to maintain appearances when a simple truth would serve them better. There was a case in Little Wickham where a woman kept her employer's correspondence long after it should have been destroyed, thinking it provided security. Instead, it became evidence of something far more serious than she had intended. The effect on Miss Finch was immediate and telling. Her already pale complexion became ashen, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips with the gesture of someone fighting nausea. Mr. Pemberton's reaction was more controlled but equally revealing. A quick glance at his briefcase, followed by an attempt to position himself between Miss Finch and Inspector Slack. Miss Marple's gentle questioning about the village's various outbuildings seemed innocent enough, but her specific mention of the ice-house folly near the old rectory caused both conspirators to exchange a look of barely concealed panic. When she casually mentioned that she had observed unusual activity in that area during her evening walks, Miss Finch's composure finally began to crack entirely. The ice-house has always been one of Lady Pringle's favorite retreats, Miss Marple observed with apparent nostalgia. So cool and quiet, even in the warmest weather, the sort of place where one might find perfect solitude for contemplation or for other purposes that require privacy and concealment. Inspector Slack, finally recognizing the significance of Miss Marple's seemingly random observations, closed his notebook with decisive authority. "I believe we should examine this ice-house immediately," he declared, though Miss Marple's gentle suggestion that they proceed with discretion prevented what might have become a precipitous action. The walk to the old rectory grounds took on the quality of a funeral procession, with Miss Finch stumbling along in obvious distress, while Mr. Pemberton maintained a facade of professional dignity that fooled no one. The ice-house folly, half hidden among overgrown rhododendrons, stood silent and apparently abandoned, but Miss Marple's experienced eye detected the subtle signs of recent use: disturbed earth around the entrance, fresh scratches on the old lock, and that persistent scent of lavender that had become Miss Finch's unwitting signature throughout the investigation. When Inspector Slack demanded the key, Miss Finch's final pretense collapsed entirely. Her confession came in broken whispers between sobs. The financial irregularities that Mr. Pemberton had been concealing, the forged codicil designed to provide legal cover for their continued control of the estate, and the desperate plan to keep Lady Pringle hidden until they could complete their manipulation of her affairs. "We never meant for it to go so far," she wept, the words tumbling out with the relief of long-suppressed guilt. "It was only supposed to be temporary, just until we could resolve the complications." But she kept asking questions, and Mr. Blackwood's demands were making everything so difficult. The discovery of Lady Pringle in the ice-house's hidden chamber was both a relief and a testament to her remarkable resilience. Though weakened by her ordeal, she retained enough of her imperious manner to demand immediate explanations and proper tea service, observations that brought the first genuine smiles to the grim proceedings. Mr. Pemberton's arrest followed swiftly, his professional facade finally crumbling as the full extent of his financial manipulations became clear. The embezzlement had been systematic and sophisticated, using his position as solicitor to divert funds while maintaining the appearance of proper estate management. Miss Finch's role had evolved from unwilling discoverer of the fraud to desperate accomplice when threatened with exposure and dismissal. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human capacity for self-deception that had characterized the entire case. Two respectable individuals had convinced themselves that their criminal actions were justified by circumstances, that temporary imprisonment was preferable to financial ruin, and that their careful planning could overcome the simple power of patient observation and accumulated truth. The village would long remember the lesson that the greatest dangers often came not from obvious threats, but from those who had learned to manipulate trust and respectability for their own desperate purposes. Miss Marple, walking home through the gathering dusk, considered once again how the smallest details, a missing button, the scent of lavender, the inconsistent wear of a typewriter ribbon, could ultimately expose even the most elaborate deceptions when observed with sufficient care and patience. Lady Pringle's ordeal was over, but the deeper truth remained, that evil could wear the most respectable faces, and that the gentle persistence of careful observation often proved more powerful than any amount of clever planning or professional authority. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the truth, like water, would always find its way to the surface, no matter how many obstacles were placed in its path. The morning after Lady Pringle's rescue dawned with the peculiar stillness that follows the resolution of great mysteries. Miss Marple found herself in the vicarage drawing-room, invited to provide what Inspector Slack had grudgingly acknowledged as the complete picture to those most affected by the deception. Lady Pringle, though still pale from her ordeal, had insisted on attending, her imperious manner intact despite the indignities she had suffered. The assembled company, Mrs. Clement, Miss Isabel, Dr. Reeves, Inspector Slack, and a subdued Mr. Blackwood, waited with the particular tension of people who knew the truth was finally within reach. Miss Marple settled herself in the corner chair with her knitting, her mild blue eyes taking in each face with the gentle attention that had served her so well throughout the investigation. "I think we must begin with Mr. Pemberton," Miss Marple said softly, her needles maintaining their steady rhythm. For it was he who created the conditions that made everything else necessary. The embezzlement had been going on for quite some time. Careful, systematic diversion of estate funds that he convinced himself were merely temporary borrowings. Such arrangements often begin with the best intentions, but they have a way of growing beyond one's ability to control them. Lady Pringle's eyes flashed with a particular anger reserved for betrayed trust. How long had this been occurring under my very nose? Miss Marple's expression grew sympathetic. I believe it began approximately 2 years ago, when certain investments Mr. Pemberton had made with his own funds failed rather spectacularly. Rather than face professional ruin, he began borrowing from estate accounts, always intending to restore the funds before anyone noticed. The tragedy is that his legal knowledge made him particularly skilled at concealing such irregularities. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with the satisfaction of a man whose theories had been vindicated. The forged codicil was designed to provide legal justification for continued access to estate funds. By creating the impression that Miss Finch was entitled to remain in service for another year with enhanced provisions, they hoped to buy time to restore the missing amounts. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Miss Finch's discovery of the irregularities was quite accidental. She found certain discrepancies while organizing correspondence. Her initial impulse was probably to protect you from the knowledge, Lady Pringle, but Mr. Pemberton convinced her that silence served everyone's interests. When your decision to alter your will in Miss Isabel's favor threatened to expose everything through routine legal review, they found themselves committed to increasingly desperate measures. The revelation of how the conspiracy had developed brought gasps of recognition from the assembled listeners. Miss Marple explained how Mr. Blackwood's legitimate grievances had provided the perfect cover for more sinister activities. Mr. Blackwood's claims against the estate were, I believe, substantially valid, she said, noting the man's surprised gratitude. Sir Reginald's affairs in Ceylon were indeed as complex as old colonial business often was, and injustices were certainly committed. But Mr. Pemberton saw in these demands not justice to be served, but exposure to be prevented. Any detailed examination of estate finances would reveal his embezzlement. The physical evidence had told its own story with remarkable clarity once properly understood. The silver button discovered by young Timothy had been the first crucial clue, not from Owen Pike's simple work jacket, but from the ornate set Mr. Pemberton had commissioned under the name Gray from Mr. Chitwick's shop. The button was lost during the initial confrontation in Lady Pringle's study, Miss Marple explained. Mr. Pemberton had arranged to meet her there while she was supposedly freshening up for the raffle. The conversation became heated when she refused to sign documents that would have given him continued authority over estate matters. The struggle that followed resulted in the lost button and Lady Pringle's forced removal to the old laundry. Miss Finch's role had evolved from reluctant discoverer to desperate accomplice as the conspiracy deepened. The companion's intimate knowledge of household routines, her access to keys for unused buildings, and her ability to move about the estate without suspicion had made her invaluable to Pemberton's scheme. The elaborate deception at the mill pond represented the conspiracy's most sophisticated element. Miss Marple's explanation of how the evidence had been planted drew murmurs of amazement from her listeners. The hat, the glove, the weighted carpet bag, all carefully arranged to suggest drowning while providing multiple suspects for investigation, she detailed. Miss Finch's nervous energy and access to Lady Pringle's belongings made her the perfect agent for this deception, but her inexperience with such matters led to crucial mistakes. The cornflower pinned incorrectly, the interior band of the hat remaining dry, the persistent scent of lavender that marked everything she touched. The typewriter evidence had been particularly revealing. The inconsistent ribbon wear on the forged codicil, the characteristic clogging of the letter E that matched Pringle Hall's machine, and the faint blue smear where a damp lavender sachet had rested, all pointed to documents prepared in haste by someone unfamiliar with proper forgery techniques. The attack on Mr. Blackwood represented the moment when careful planning gave way to panic. Miss Marple continued. Mr. Pemberton's assault was designed to silence a witness who could contradict his version of events and to retrieve documents that might expose his fraud. The missing silver button from his waistcoat, observed by Mr. Blackwood during the attack, provided the final confirmation of his involvement. As Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable explanation continued, the full scope of the deception became clear. Miss Finch, who had been listening with increasing distress, finally broke down entirely, her confession tumbling out between sobs. "We never meant for it to go so far," she wept, the words carrying the weight of accumulated guilt. "It was only supposed to be temporary, just until the financial matters could be resolved. But Lady Pringle kept asking questions, and Mr. Blackwood's demands were making everything so complicated. Each step seemed to require another, and before we knew it..." Mr. Pemberton, his professional facade finally crumbling completely, acknowledged his crimes with the bitter dignity of a man whose careful plans had been undone by the accumulation of small, persistent truths. The embezzlement had indeed begun as temporary measures, but the amounts involved had grown beyond his ability to restore them through legitimate means. Inspector Slack's formal arrests followed swiftly, though the legal proceedings would take months to complete. The recovery of Lady Pringle alive transformed what might have been a murder investigation into charges of kidnapping, fraud, and assault. Serious crimes, but ones that carried the possibility of eventual redemption rather than the finality of capital punishment. Lady Pringle's first concern, once the immediate crisis had passed, was for the welfare of those who had remained loyal. Owen Pike would receive an excellent reference and assistance in finding new employment, while the remaining household staff would be provided for during the inevitable disruption of estate reorganization. Miss Isabel's relief at her stepmother's safe return was tempered by the profound sadness of betrayal by people she had trusted. Dr. Reeves, ever practical, saw in the resolution an opportunity for the new beginning that he and Miss Isabel had long hoped for, though the shadow of recent events would take time to fade. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked home through streets that seemed both familiar and subtly changed. The case had revealed the curious human capacity for self-deception, how respectable people could convince themselves that criminal actions were justified by circumstances, that temporary wrongs could somehow be made right through careful planning and professional authority. The village would need time to process the revelation that such elaborate criminality had been operating beneath the surface of their comfortable routines. Mrs. Clement was already wondering about charitable visits to Miss Finch in custody, while Colonel Bantry was revising his theories about the reliability of professional men and household servants. In her cottage parlour, Miss Marple reflected on the lesson that evil rarely announced itself with dramatic flourishes. Instead, it came in small compromises, each one seemingly reasonable, each one nudging a soul a little further from the path of honesty. Yet goodness, too, was made of small things. A boy bringing a found button, a shopkeeper remembering a commission, a taxi driver recalling a nervous passenger, a village's collective concern for truth and justice. The case of Lady Pringle's disappearance would become part of St. Mary Mead's collective memory, a reminder that the greatest dangers often wore the most respectable faces. But it would also serve as testament to the power of patient observation and gentle persistence in exposing even the most carefully constructed deceptions. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her needles resuming their quiet work. Outside, the village settled into its evening routines, forever changed by the events of recent days, but somehow stronger for having faced the truth about human nature's capacity for both great evil and enduring good. In her long experience, she had learned that justice, like light, had a way of penetrating even the most carefully constructed darkness, not through dramatic revelation, but through the simple accumulation of small, stubborn facts that no amount of clever planning could ultimately overcome. The truth had come to rest where it belonged, and St. Mary Mead could once again find peace in the knowledge that patient observation and gentle persistence had triumphed over deception and despair. The days following Lady Pringle's rescue brought the peculiar mixture of relief and unease that always followed the exposure of elaborate deceptions. Miss Marple observed from her cottage window as St. Mary Mead slowly adjusted to the new configuration of truth, like a garden settling after a storm had uprooted familiar landmarks and revealed what had been growing beneath. Lady Pringle's recovery proved remarkably swift, though the ordeal had left subtle changes in her imperious manner. Within a fortnight she had resumed her customary role in village affairs, but with a new discernment about the nature of loyalty and trust. Her first official act was to provide Owen Pike with an excellent reference and a financial settlement that acknowledged the injustice of his temporary suspicion. The chauffeur accepted both with quiet dignity, his departure for a new position in Much Benham marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "A man should work with his hands honestly," Lady Pringle observed to Miss Marple during one of her afternoon calls, "and not be suspected for the crimes of his betters." The comment carried the weight of hard-won wisdom about the deceptive nature of respectability. The legal proceedings moved forward with Inspector Slack's preferred methodical pace. Mr. Pemberton's confession to embezzlement, fraud, and kidnapping had simplified matters considerably, though unraveling the full extent of his financial manipulations would require months of careful accounting. His professional reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, had been destroyed in a matter of days by the accumulation of small, persistent truths that no amount of legal expertise could overcome. Miss Finch's fate proved more complex and ultimately more tragic. Her genuine remorse and the desperate circumstances that had drawn her into the conspiracy earned some measure of sympathy from both court and community. Lady Pringle's testimony on her former companion's behalf spoke to the fundamental decency that had made the betrayal so particularly painful. Yet the law required that consequences follow actions, regardless of the motivations behind them. Miss Isabel's engagement to Dr. Reeves, announced quietly 6 weeks after her stepmother's rescue, represented the kind of new beginning that could only emerge from shared adversity. The couple's wedding plans, now discussed with Lady Pringle's full approval, marked not only their personal happiness, but the community's return to the normal rhythms of celebration after the disruption of criminal revelation. Mr. Blackwood's vindication brought particular satisfaction to those who had witnessed his transformation from mysterious threat to legitimate claimant. Lady Pringle's decision to honor his claims against the estate, despite the pain they had initially caused, demonstrated the kind of moral courage that had sustained her through her ordeal. His temporary residence at the Crown while estate matters were settled allowed the village to observe his true character, that of a man seeking justice rather than revenge. The village's collective processing of these revelations revealed much about the nature of small communities and their capacity for both judgment and adaptation. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been so certain about the guilt of traveling people and foreign influences, found herself reconsidering the comfortable assumptions that had shaped her worldview. Colonel Bantry's military certainty about character and reliability had been shaken by the discovery that professional credentials provided no guarantee of moral integrity. Yet this knowledge brought not cynicism, but a more sophisticated understanding of how evil could flourish behind familiar facades. The comfortable assumption that wickedness announced itself with dramatic flourishes had been replaced by awareness that the greatest dangers often wore the most respectable faces. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human tendency to believe that intelligence and planning could overcome the simple power of accumulated truth. Mr. Pemberton's elaborate scheme had been undone not by brilliant deduction or dramatic revelation, but by the patient observation of small inconsistencies, a missing button, the scent of lavender where it shouldn't be, a typewriter ribbon's telltale wear patterns. The old laundry and ice house, scenes of Lady Pringle's imprisonment, were eventually sealed and converted to more pleasant purposes. The village's collective memory, would preserve the knowledge of what had occurred in those spaces, but practical life required that even the most significant locations eventually return to ordinary use. The transformation served as a metaphor for the community's ability to absorb shocking revelations, while maintaining its essential character. On a Sunday evening several weeks later, Miss Marple sat by her cottage window with her knitting, watching the last light fade over the village green. Somewhere, a piano stumbled into a familiar hymn and found its way, the sound carrying on the still air like a gentle benediction. The little nosegay Lady Pringle had brought as a gesture of gratitude had begun to droop in an ordinary way that was somehow comforting. Things faded, and then other things took their place. The case had demonstrated once again that the greatest mysteries often had the simplest solutions, hidden not by complexity, but by the very ordinariness of evil's appearance. Human nature, she reflected, was not a puzzle to be solved once and for all, but a pattern one observed throughout a lifetime. Tiny, repetitious, revealing, the design emerging by degrees through patient attention to detail. Her knitting needles resumed their quiet rhythm as St. Mary Mead settled into evening. The truth had been coaxed into daylight through gentle persistence rather than dramatic confrontation, and the village, chastened but unsurprised in its deepest self, would continue with its baking and quarrels, its choir practices and quiet heroics. Miss Marple had seen a little wickedness and a little goodness, and found both entirely credible, entirely human, and entirely worthy of the careful attention that served as the community's best defense against those who would exploit trust and respectability for their own dark purposes. The mystery of Lady Pringle's disappearance had ended, but Miss Marple's watch over St. Mary Mead continued. In her long experience with the complexities of human nature, each resolution brought not an ending but a new beginning, another opportunity to exercise the gentle vigilance that kept evil at bay through the simple expedient of noticing what others overlooked and remembering what others preferred to forget. Outside her window, the village breathed peacefully in the gathering dusk, forever changed by recent events, but somehow stronger for having faced the truth about human nature's capacity for both great deception and enduring good. Miss Marple folded her work into her basket and turned out the lamp with the quiet satisfaction of one who had seen justice served through patience, observation, and an unwavering commitment to the small, stubborn truths that no amount of clever planning could ultimately overcome. The first frost of winter had touched St. Mary Mead when the final piece of the puzzle arrived at Pringle Hall, delivered by the morning post with the casual efficiency that often characterizes the most significant revelations. Miss Marple, invited for tea on that crisp December afternoon, observed Lady Pringle's reaction to the small registered parcel with the gentle attention that had served her so well throughout the investigation. The package bore the return address of a respectable jeweler in Conduit Street, and its contents would provide the last confirmation of Mr. Pemberton's systematic betrayal. Within the tissue wrapping lay the Pringle pearls in their familiar, lustrous perfection, accompanied by a note explaining that a gentleman calling himself Gray had left them for restringing weeks earlier, with charges gone unpaid. Recent newspaper notices and an inquiry from Mr. Chitwick had prompted the jeweler to write, seeking the rightful owner. "So that is the last of it," Lady Pringle murmured, her fingers tracing the familiar weight of the necklace. The pearls seemed to glow with their characteristic understated elegance, so different from the eager brightness of the imitations she had worn to the garden party. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I suspected at the garden party, you know. The silk between the knots showed no darkening at the joins, and the pearls themselves were rather too enthusiastic with the light. True pearls, like true ladies, are quieter in their manner." The revelation completed the picture of Mr. Pemberton's gradual descent into criminality. His trial, concluded just before Christmas, had resulted in a 7-year sentence that acknowledged both the severity of his crimes and the systematic nature of his deception. The theft of the pearls had likely been his first transgression, a desperate measure that had made subsequent crimes seem increasingly reasonable. Miss Finch, whose genuine remorse and cooperation had weighed heavily in her favor, received 18 months, a sentence that Lady Pringle's extraordinary testimony had helped to moderate. The legal proceedings had revealed the full extent of the conspiracy's sophistication. Every penny of embezzled funds would be restored to the estate, though the process would take months to complete. Mr. Pemberton's confession had been thorough and unflinching, sparing the community the ordeal of a protracted trial while ensuring that justice was both served and seen to be served. Lady Pringle's response to her ordeal demonstrated the kind of practical wisdom that transforms personal suffering into community benefit. Her establishment of a charitable fund for household staff facing financial difficulties would be administered through the vicarage, ensuring that future generations might be spared the desperate circumstances that had led Miss Finch astray. The fund represented not merely generosity, but a deep understanding of how respectability could become a trap for those with no other resources. The wedding of Miss Isabel and Dr. Reeves, celebrated in the village church on a morning bright with winter sunshine, provided the community with the joyful resolution it needed. Lady Pringle's presence at the ceremony, radiant with genuine happiness for her stepdaughter, marked both personal healing and the village's return to its natural rhythms of celebration and hope. The young couple's love, tested by suspicion and uncertainty, had emerged stronger for the trial, their future approached with the mature appreciation that comes only through shared adversity. Mr. Blackwood's vindication had brought him not only financial restitution, but the peace that had eluded him for decades. His decision to purchase a modest cottage near the old mill pond demonstrated remarkable magnanimity, transforming a site of deception into a symbol of justice served. His expertise in colonial affairs had already proven valuable to several village families, suggesting that even the most painful chapters of life could be transformed into sources of service and community benefit. The physical reminders of the conspiracy had been quietly absorbed back into the ordinary landscape of village life. The old laundry now served as proper storage for seasonal church decorations, while the ice-house folly had been sealed and planted with climbing roses that would bloom each summer as a living memorial to truth's triumph over deception. These transformations spoke to the village's remarkable capacity to absorb shocking revelations while maintaining its essential character. As Christmas Eve brought the traditional carol service, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious way that criminal cases, however shocking in their immediate impact, eventually became part of the larger tapestry of community memory. The familiar faces around her in the candle-lit church told their own stories of human complexity, the capacity for both great evil and enduring good that made life simultaneously tragic and hopeful. Lady Pringle, magnificent in dark blue velvet and her recovered pearls, sat with the newlyweds in the front pew, their presence a testament to healing's quiet power. Even Owen Pike had returned for the service, his new prosperity evident in his well-cut coat and the obvious contentment that had replaced his former sullen anxiety. The sight of these restored relationships reminded Miss Marple that justice, properly administered, could indeed lead to redemption rather than mere punishment. Walking home through the crisp winter air, Miss Marple considered how the case had demonstrated once again that the greatest mysteries often had the simplest solutions, hidden not by complexity, but by the very ordinariness of evil's appearance. Human nature remained what it had always been, a mixture of nobility and selfishness, wisdom and folly that required constant vigilance and endless compassion to navigate successfully. Her cottage welcomed her with familiar warmth, the Christmas cards on her mantelpiece, including one from Miss Finch, written with careful gratitude for kindness shown during dark hours. Lady Pringle's formal note of thanks occupied the place of honor, its elegant script acknowledging not only Miss Marple's role in the resolution, but her discretion in handling its aftermath. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring truth that had guided her through this case and so many others, that evil, however cleverly disguised, eventually revealed itself through small inconsistencies and human frailties. The patient observer, armed with nothing more than attention to detail and understanding of human nature, could ultimately triumph over the most elaborate deceptions. St. Mary Mead slept peacefully outside her windows, forever chained by recent events, but somehow stronger for having faced the truth about the capacity for both great deception and enduring good that resided in every human heart. The mystery of Lady Pringle's disappearance had ended, but Miss Marple's gentle vigilance continued, ready to confront whatever new challenges human nature might present, with the same patient observation and unwavering commitment to truth that had served her beloved village throughout her long and eventful life. The truth had found its proper place at last, and with it came the quiet satisfaction that justice, like the turning seasons, moved with its own inexorable rhythm toward resolution and renewal. In her long experience with the complexities of human nature, Miss Marple had learned that each resolution brought not an ending, but a new beginning, another opportunity to exercise the gentle vigilance that kept evil at bay through the simple expedient of noticing what others overlooked and remembering what others preferred to forget. Spring arrived in St. Mary Mead with the particular tenderness that follows a harsh winter, bringing with it the kind of gentle renewal that seemed to acknowledge both loss and hope. Miss Marple, tending the daffodils that had pushed through the earth beside her cottage gate, reflected on how the village had weathered the storms of recent months with the same quiet resilience that characterized the returning season. 6 months had passed since Lady Pringle's rescue, and the changes wrought by those dramatic events had settled into the comfortable patterns of village life. Lady Pringle herself remained formidable, but her imperious manner had been tempered by a new discernment about human character that came only through hard experience. Her charitable fund for household staff had already prevented 3 families from the desperate circumstances that might have led them astray, transforming personal suffering into community wisdom with the practical efficiency that had always marked her approach to life's challenges. The newlyweds had found their rhythm with the deep contentment of those who had weathered suspicion and uncertainty together. Dr. Reeves's practice flourished under Lady Pringle's enthusiastic endorsement, while Mrs. Reeves, as Miss Isabel now preferred to be known, had discovered unexpected talents for organizing village activities that channeled her stepmother's energy in more collaborative directions. Their happiness provided the community with a tangible reminder that love could indeed triumph over deception and fear. Miss Finch's monthly letters from prison arrived with clockwork regularity, written in her careful hand, with gratitude that never quite masked the underlying sadness of choices that could not be undone. Lady Pringle's replies, dictated to Mrs. Clement with characteristic briskness but genuine compassion, offered hope for a different future when the sentence was completed. Redemption, Miss Marple had observed, was always possible for those willing to acknowledge their failures and work towards something better. Mr. Blackwood's transformation from mysterious threat to valued community member had been perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire affair. His cottage near the mill pond had become a place of quiet scholarship where he worked on historical research that would set certain colonial records straight while maintaining the dignity that had sustained him through years of injustice. His expertise had already proven invaluable to several village families, demonstrating how even the most painful experiences could eventually serve the greater good. Owen Pike's occasional visits from Much Benham brought news of his prosperity and contentment in his new position. The excellent reference Lady Pringle had provided, along with her generous settlement, had opened doors that his working-class origins might otherwise have kept closed. His transformation from sullen suspicion to quiet confidence served as a reminder that justice, properly administered, could indeed heal the wounds inflicted by false accusation. As Miss Marple dead-headed the last of the winter roses, she considered how the case had demonstrated once again that truth emerged not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small, persistent facts. A silver button that belonged to no chauffeur's jacket. A cornflower pinned the wrong way round by nervous hands. The telltale progression of a typewriter's worn letter betraying its own weary habits. Lavender, where lavender had no business being. A hat's inner band too dry for so wet a tale. Each detail trifling in itself, yet together as decisive as any signed confession. The mystery had revealed the curious human tendency to believe that intelligence and careful planning could overcome the simple power of accumulated truth. Mr. Pemberton's elaborate deception had been undone not by brilliant deduction or confrontational drama, but by the gentle persistence of careful observation and the stubborn refusal of small facts to bend themselves to convenient narratives. Walking toward the village green as the church bells chimed the morning hour, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring lesson that evil seldom announced itself with melodramatic flourishes. Instead, it came in tidy gloves and careful smiles, hidden behind the very respectability that communities like St. Mary Mead held most dear. The best defense against such deception was neither suspicion nor cleverness, but attention and memory and a heart that understood the small vanities and larger fears by which people navigated their daily lives. The village had absorbed the shock of betrayal and emerged stronger for the experience. The comfortable assumption that wickedness wore obviously wicked faces had been replaced by a more sophisticated understanding of human complexity, yet this knowledge had brought not cynicism, but wisdom. St. Mary Mead continued its eternal dance between shadow and light, its residents perhaps more careful in their judgments, but no less kind in their fundamental nature. As she settled into her favorite chair with her knitting basket, Miss Marple considered that the case of Lady Pringle's disappearance would take its place among the village's collective memories as both cautionary tale and testament to the power of truth. In her long experience with the mysteries of human nature, she had learned that every ending was also a beginning, every resolution an opportunity for redemption, and every mystery solved a reminder that patient observation and gentle persistence could illuminate even the darkest corners of the human heart. Outside her cottage windows, St. Mary Mead breathed peacefully in the spring sunshine, forever changed by recent events, but somehow stronger for having faced the truth about the capacity for both great deception and enduring good that resided in every human soul. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their quiet rhythm, ready to confront whatever new challenges human nature might present, with the same unwavering commitment to justice that had served her beloved village throughout her long and eventful life. The mystery was concluded, but the watch continued, gentle and unceasing as the turning seasons themselves.